Imagine leaving your house for a few weeks, trusting your own child to watch over it, and coming back to find strangers living there. That's the nightmare I never thought could happen to me. My name is Rosalind, and before I take you into the darkest chapter of my life, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Leave it in the comments. I'll be reading every word. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, before everything shattered. I had a small, warm home. Nothing grand, nothing that would make the front page of a magazine, but it was mine. Every corner carried years of memory. The kitchen where my late husband used to hum old tunes while brewing coffee, the living room where birthdays turned into loud, laughing evenings, and the front porch where I sat with a cup of tea to watch the seasons change. To me, that house was not just walls and bricks. It was roots, safety, and the last thread connecting me to the people I had lost. My son grew up inside those walls. As a little boy, he used to run through the hallway in his socks, sliding across the floor, his laughter echoing louder than the old grandfather clock. Back then, I saw him as gentle, curious, a little mischievous, but sweet at heart. He was my only child, and after his father passed away, I gave him every ounce of love and sacrifice I could manage. But time has a way of testing bonds. As he grew older, the tenderness in him hardened into something else. He became restless, always chasing the next shiny thing, money, status, attention. He began to see me less as a mother and more as, well, I could feel it in the way he sighed when I asked for help with groceries, or how he rolled his eyes when I told old stories. A burden. That's what I had become to him, though he never said it outright. When my health began to falter, I needed to step away for a while. I had fallen, fractured my hip, and the doctors insisted on a proper rehabilitation program. At first, I resisted. The idea of leaving my home, even temporarily, filled me with dread. But my son said, "Mom, you'll be fine. Just focus on getting better. I'll handle things here." His words sounded like comfort, but there was a sharpness in his tone, almost as though he couldn't wait for me to be out of the way. Still, I wanted to believe him. I told myself he was just stressed. I told myself he loved me deep down, even if he was rough on the edges. I trusted him with the only thing that mattered most besides my own life, our home. The rehab center wasn't terrible, but it wasn't home either. The food was bland, the halls smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the nights stretched long. I worked hard, though, determined to walk without pain, to reclaim some strength. I counted the days until I could return to my porch, to the rose bushes I tended every spring, to the photographs still hanging in the hallway. What I didn't know then was that while I was learning to stand again, my son was plotting to take the very ground from under me. Looking back, there were signs, little comments he made during his rare visits. "The house is too big for you anyway." Or, "Think about all the money sitting in those walls, Mom. Do you even realize how much it's worth?" At the time, I thought it was idle talk, the kind of nonsense young people say when they dream of fast money. I never imagined he would take action on those thoughts. After all, this was my child, the boy I had rocked to sleep, the boy I had defended in school when others picked on him. But when you're blinded by love, you don't always see the wolf forming in your own living room. When the day finally came for me to leave the center, I was full of hope. I remember clutching my bag filled with new exercises and encouragement from the therapists and telling myself, this is a fresh chapter. We'll be closer. Maybe he'll see how hard I've worked to get better. What I didn't realize was that the chapter waiting for me wasn't about healing. It was about betrayal. That house, the one I had poured decades of my soul into, was no longer mine. And that truth would hit me harder than any fall, any broken bone, or any loss I had endured before. The ride back from the rehabilitation center felt like a victory lap. My body still ached, but I could walk with less pain, and in my heart I carried a spark of pride. I kept imagining stepping onto my porch again, feeling the rough wood under my palm, and unlocking the front door to the smell of home. But when the taxi pulled up to my street, I noticed something strange before I even reached the driveway. The curtains in the living room were gone, replaced with blinds I had never chosen. The flower pots I kept by the steps were missing. My rose bush, the one I had nursed for nearly 20 years, looked as though someone had hacked it down with clumsy hands. I thought, maybe he's just redecorating, trying to surprise me. The surprise was waiting all right, just not the kind that brings joy. When I opened the gate, a woman I'd never seen before stepped out of my house. She wasn't startled, not even polite. She looked me up and down like I was a stranger trespassing on her land. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold. My throat tightened. "This is my home." "Who are you?" Her expression barely flickered. "We bought this place last month. The papers are in my husband's name. I thought I had misheard her." My ears rang, the way they do after a sharp blow. I shook my head. "No, you don't understand. This is my house. My name is on the deed. My son is here. Where is he?" The woman just shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with him." And then she closed the door of my house. I stood there on the porch, trembling, my bag still clutched in my hand. A neighbor came out across the street, hesitated, then quickly turned away like they hadn't seen me. My knees nearly buckled as I tried to piece together the impossible. When I finally found my son later that evening, he didn't bother with excuses or remorse. He smirked, almost amused at my shock. "Mom," he said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed like a king holding court. "You couldn't keep up with the place. You're too old, too fragile. I sold it. You should be thanking me I couldn't breathe." You sold my house? The home your father built? Without asking me?" His eyes hardened, no trace of the boy I once rocked to sleep. "You left me with all the responsibility. Do you know how much pressure that was? I fixed it. I turned dead weight into money. Be grateful you don't have to worry about it anymore." Grateful. He wanted me to be grateful. The betrayal cut deeper than words can reach. It wasn't just a house he had sold. He had sold my memories, my safety, my place in this world. He had uprooted me as though I were nothing more than old furniture he didn't want cluttering his life. I tried to fight back. I told him I never signed anything, that he had no right. But then he revealed the ugliest part. He had forged my name. The notary, the signatures, all carefully arranged with lies. "Don't make a scene, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You'll only embarrass yourself. Nobody's going to believe you anyway. Everyone knows you've been in rehab. You'll look unstable." That word, unstable, hung in the air like poison. He wasn't just taking my house. He was taking my dignity, my reputation, and twisting them into weapons. I left his place in a daze, dragging my bag behind me like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The streets I had walked all my life suddenly felt foreign, hostile. Every porch light seemed to shine on me with judgment. I had become the woman without a home, the mother whose own child had betrayed her. That night I sat on a bench outside the church down the block. I pressed my palms together and whispered, "Lord, what did I do to deserve this?" But the silence gave me no answer. Only the cold wind answered, biting through my coat. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be completely displaced, not just physically, but spiritually. The one person who should have sheltered me had thrown me into the storm without a second thought. And that was only the beginning of the humiliation I would endure. I wish I could tell you that I found a quick solution, that someone stepped in to right the wrongs. But life isn't a fairy tale. The day after learning the truth, I woke up on a borrowed couch with a stiff back and an even stiffer spirit. The friend who let me stay did so reluctantly. She had her own family, her own problems, and though she smiled politely, I could feel the weight of my presence pressing on her. It's one thing to visit someone for tea. It's another to watch them unpack a small bag of clothes, trying to fold themselves into the corner of a stranger's life. I tried calling my son again, desperate for any sign of remorse. He picked up once, his voice sharp, impatient. "Stop bothering me, Mom. You're acting pathetic. The house is gone. Get over it." Then came the sting that left me silent. "You should be grateful I didn't throw you into the streets myself." He hung up before I could answer. From then on, he ignored my calls. Sometimes he'd block my number for weeks. I would hear bits of gossip from neighbors, whispers that spread faster than fire in dry grass. She's lost it. She was in rehab. Her son had to take control, lies he planted to protect his image. One afternoon, I passed by the house that used to be mine. I stood across the street watching strangers' children running through the yard, their toys scattered across the grass where my rosebush once stood. My son was on the porch, laughing loudly with a group of friends, a drink in his hand. He didn't look like a man who carried guilt. He looked like a man who had traded his mother for applause. That sight burned deeper than any wound. He hadn't just taken my home. He had twisted the story so that I looked like the villain in his play. The humiliation spread into every corner of my life. Family gatherings? I was quietly left off the invitations. Weddings, birthdays, even funerals. I'd hear about them afterward, long after the photographs had been posted online. Relatives whispered that I was unstable or too fragile. My son had poisoned them with his version of events, and it was easier for them to believe his story than to confront the ugliness of what he'd done. I learned what loneliness truly meant. It wasn't just being without a roof. It was being erased from your own bloodline, treated like a stain they'd rather scrub out of sight. In those nights, lying awake in spare rooms or shelters, my mind replayed every memory of him as a boy. His first steps, the way he clung to my skirt when he was shy, how he cried when his father passed, and I promised him we'd always stick together. Each memory twisted into a knife. How had that tender little boy grown into this cruel man? But grief has a way of fermenting into something else if you let it sit long enough. At first, I begged the Lord for answers. Then I begged him for strength. And slowly, a different thought began to creep into my chest. If he thought I was weak, maybe I had been. Maybe I had trusted too blindly. But weakness doesn't last forever, and I knew him better than anyone. I knew his greed, his shortcuts, his arrogance. One evening, as I sat alone in a quiet shelter, I whispered to myself, he thinks he's untouchable, but he's forgotten who taught him how to walk in the first place. He's forgotten whose name he carries. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but the first spark of resolve lit in me that night. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the humiliation, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in months: direction. And once a mother finds her direction, even the son who betrayed her should be very, very afraid. People often think revenge comes like lightning, sudden, hot, uncontrollable. But in my case, it arrived like a whisper, a seed planted in silence, watered by humiliation, and nurtured by every cruel word my son had thrown at me. It began with a chance meeting. One afternoon, while I was leaving the church pantry with a bag of donated bread, I ran into an old friend, Mr. Carter, a retired banker who used to live down the street. His face lit up with recognition, though I was half ashamed for him to see me in that state. We sat on the church steps and talked. I told him some of what had happened, not everything, but enough for him to shake his head with disgust. "Rosalind," he said, "you were always sharp. Don't let him strip you of that, too." His words stuck. Sharp. I had almost forgotten that part of myself. Before my health declined, before grief dulled me, I used to handle our family's finances. I was the one who kept track of bills, mortgages, savings. My husband always said I had a mind like a ledger. Nothing slipped past me. That night, I pulled out what little paperwork I still had in my bag. Old copies of account numbers, my name on certain documents, things my son probably assumed I'd forgotten. And the more I looked, the more I realized he had been sloppy, reckless. His business, though flashy on the outside, was tied to me in ways he hadn't considered. Years earlier, when he begged me for help starting it, I had co-signed papers, lent him money, given him access to accounts. At the time, I thought I was helping him build a future. In reality, I had given myself the very key to his empire. I could feel my heart beating faster as the realization sank in. He thought he'd stripped me of everything, but he had left the door wide open for me to take it all back. Still, I had to be careful. Revenge is a dish best served cold, yes, but also carefully plated. One wrong move and he'd shut me out completely. So I started small. I visited the library every day pretending to be just another old woman reading magazines, when in fact I was poring over business law, property rights, and banking rules. I asked discreet questions at the local clerk's office, piecing together how much legal authority I still had tied to his accounts. The more I learned, the stronger I felt. Meanwhile, my son paraded around town, oblivious. I'd hear stories of him throwing parties, showing off his new car, bragging about how smart he was to flip a house no one else wanted. If only he knew the storm quietly brewing behind the scenes. One night, I caught sight of him in a restaurant window, laughing with his friends, mocking me openly. "She's probably begging at the church again," I overheard him say. His friends chuckled, raising their glasses. I walked past with my chin high, but inside, I made a promise to myself. You'll laugh now, but when the dust settles, you'll have nothing left to laugh about. The plan grew piece by piece. First, I confirmed that my name was still tied to his business accounts. Then I discovered something even sweeter. He had been careless with taxes, sloppy with paperwork. If pushed in the right direction, his empire could crumble from the inside. The more I uncovered, the less fear I felt. Instead of lying awake in despair, I began lying awake in calculation. It was like stepping into a part of myself I hadn't touched in years, the part that was capable, steady, unshakable. For weeks, I played the role of the discarded mother, invisible and broken. All the while, I was building the scaffolding of his downfall. And one morning, as I looked at the papers spread out before me in the library, I whispered under my breath, "You took my home, my dignity, my peace. Now I'll take everything you built on the bones of my trust." That was the day the mother he thought was finished came back to life. When you're pushed into a corner, you can either curl up and disappear, or you can stand, dust off your apron, and get to work. I chose the latter, not because I fancied myself brave, but because the indignity of being powerless tasted worse than the toil it would take to fix things. I started where the lawyer in me lives: paperwork. There's a peculiar clarity in ink and stamps. They don't care for feelings. They obey procedure. For a woman who had once balanced ledgers and reconciled accounts in the quiet hours, that was good news. I dug through the loose papers I'd carried in my bag for months: bank statements, old tax notices, receipts, anything that tied my name to my son's small empire. Each scrap was a breadcrumb leading me back into the life I'd been shoved out of. My first move was simple and surgical. I contacted the bank. Polite, slow, like an old woman whose memory was sometimes foggy. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, waited for the clerk to repeat facts that helped me confirm legal links. There is a peculiar blindness in people who assume the elderly are harmless. They let you wave through the library doors, but they never expect you to read the ledger behind the curtain. That underestimation became my advantage. Once I proved my ties to certain accounts, co-signatures, dormant power of attorney that my son had assumed was lost, small investments listed under my name, I set defensive traps. I requested temporary freezes, not dramatic or loud, but precise. Put a restriction on outgoing transfers, pending verification, flag accounts for unusual activity, request updated identification for any withdrawal over a certain amount. The bank obliged, slow as a glacier, but obedient to rules. Each delay I planted was a pebble in his shoes. He noticed, of course. Men who build their world on haste are easily unsettled by patience. At first he laughed it off, confident that paperwork was a mere inconvenience. He liked to think money made him invincible. He didn't understand how a single signature could topple his bravado. He called me twice in succession, voice rising like steam. "Mom, what have you done?" he barked. "Who do you think you are messing with my accounts?" "You'll regret." "You sold my home," I said, cool as kitchen tile. "I'm only making sure you can't sell the rest of me." He slammed the phone down like a child with tantrum toys, then tried other tricks. He emailed, threatened, sent messages filled with the same venom he always wore in public, derision thinly veiled as concern. "You'll ruin everything," he wrote. "You should be grateful for what I did. You're making trouble for yourself." He never stopped to consider what everything meant to me. So pressure can break a man who's built on brittle things. The pressure from the bank was a whisper at first, then a tightening band. He began missing payments on vendor invoices because funds weren't flowing like they used to. Suppliers grew impatient with checks that bounced or cleared late. His staff, people he'd hired with promises and swagger, started to whisper about stability. Rumors traveled faster than his apologies could. I didn't celebrate when the first invoice went unpaid. I felt neither glee nor triumph. I felt a steady, quiet satisfaction. Justice, in my mind, wasn't a feast. It was a correction. He had taken from me. I was recalibrating the scales. Then came the legally satisfying part. Paperwork that transferred operational control back to me. Because I had co-signed loans and was listed on certain contracts, I could step in, not as a vengeful stranger, but as a rightful stakeholder. I filed the necessary notices, attended meetings with board members of his tiny company. He had never bothered to introduce me. They assumed I was a harmless relic, and insisted that financial oversight be reinstated. Watching men who once deferred to his charm now defer to my calm was an odd kind of balm. The day I walked into one of his shops, not as an embarrassed mother, but as a woman with authority, he was there. He saw me from across the room, his face folded into something like disbelief and fury. He tried to hurl insults to shame me in front of staff and customers. "You don't belong here." "This is my business," he spat, red in the face. I met his rage with a stillness that made it worse for him. "You belong to the past you chose," I said quietly. "This belongs to whoever keeps it honest." The manager, an older woman who had watched me from the start, stepped forward, telling him that the paperwork was clear. The accounts had been restricted. Contracts needed signatures from both parties. He had run out of shortcuts. He raged privately at first, banging on closed doors, cursing at locked bank kiosks. Then he raged publicly, storming the city council to complain, making a spectacle of himself outside the bank. He shouted that I had stolen from him, that I had used his mother's name to take his livelihood. Everyone saw the irony. To the townsfolk who had watched the entire sad play, his tantrum read like the confession it was. What cut deeper than his screams was the look he gave me when the last transaction cleared in my favor. Raw, jaw-gnawing disbelief mixed with a bruised entitlement. He had spent years building his persona on the belief that he could take and never be taken from. For the first time, he was the one left with empty hands. He tried to bargain, to beg, pleas that were a bitter echo of the lullabies I once hummed when he was a child. He offered apologies that landed hollow as coins. He promised change with the same breath he used to excuse cruelty. I listened, because I'm not heartless. I only weighed his words against the ledger of my life. When he realized the business was no longer at his fingertips, his rudeness swelled into something dangerous. Threats layered over pleas, poison laced in nostalgia. He demanded his accounts, slurred about lawsuits, threatened exposure, and tried to humiliate me in front of those I had fought to protect. He remained rude until the end of the showdown, as I knew he would. Rude because repentance would be too much work. And in that rude, furious silence, I finally felt the room tilt back into balance. I had not only reclaimed what he had taken, I had reclaimed a version of myself that would not be sidelined by cruelty. The house was gone. Yes, but the part of me that held a name, a history, and a mind, those were mine still. I would not let him cast them away again. When the accounts finally shifted out of his reach, my son's empire collapsed faster than I ever expected. It was like watching a house of cards fall apart, not from one grand gesture, but from a dozen small tremors. Suppliers refused to extend him credit. Employees, tired of bouncing paychecks, began to walk away. Friends who once filled his house, sipping from expensive bottles and boasting of his success, suddenly had other places to be. The laughter that once rolled from his porch went silent, leaving only a hollow shell of a man pacing the ruins of what he had built on my back. At first, he came at me with fury. He called, texted, showed up at the library where I sat most mornings, his face red and voice venomous. "You've ruined me. Do you understand what you've done?" I didn't shout back. I didn't need to. I would simply close my book, fold my hands, and say, "I understand perfectly." My stillness drove him madder than my words ever could. When rage failed him, he tried another mask, desperation. He showed up outside the church pantry one evening, waiting by the steps. His shoulders slumped, eyes wide, voice softer. "Mom," he said, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw the boy he once was. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. You're my mother. Can't we fix this?" But behind his tone, the arrogance still simmered. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry for being caught. He wanted his safety net back, not reconciliation. I told him, "You took from me and never looked back. I won't let you do it again." His face hardened instantly, like ice cracking under sudden cold. "You'll regret this," he spat, before storming off into the night. That was the last real conversation we ever had. The community, the very people who had once whispered about my instability, started to shift their eyes. They saw him unravel in public, his temper, his bitterness, his blame. They saw me standing steady, carrying myself with dignity despite the storm. Some apologized quietly, others avoided me out of shame, but the balance had changed. Yet victory didn't taste sweet. I didn't dance on his downfall. I didn't gloat or shout triumph to the heavens. Instead, I sat alone most nights, staring at the ceiling, and asked myself the same question: how did we get here? Because beneath the ledger and the legal triumphs, there was still the ache of a mother who had lost her child long before the business collapsed. I grieved not for the man he was now, but for the boy I once held against my chest, the boy who promised me he'd always take care of me. That boy was gone, buried under greed and arrogance, and no victory could bring him back. I would see him sometimes, stumbling out of bars, his face thinner, his clothes rumpled. He carried himself like a ghost haunting the town, clinging to scraps of pride. People crossed the street to avoid him now. The same ones who once clung to his money turned their backs. Neighbors asked me if I felt guilty, if maybe I should have forgiven him. "After all," one woman whispered, "he's still your son." I smiled, not unkindly but firmly. "Yes," I said, "and I am still his mother. But being a mother doesn't mean I am his victim." The whispers never ended, but they no longer pierced me. They were just background noise, the mutterings of those too timid to take their own stands. What mattered was that I had reclaimed something more important than a house, more important than accounts or papers. I had reclaimed myself, my dignity, my voice. And if that meant living without him, then so be it. Because sometimes the cruelest truth is the clearest one. Not all children grow into the love you pour into them. Some take it and twist it until it becomes a chain around your neck. And when that happens, you can either let them pull you under or you can cut the chain and breathe free. I chose freedom. You've stayed with me through the storm, and for that, I thank you. I lost a house. I lost the son I once believed in, but I found something I hadn't realized I'd misplaced. Myself. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly at a library table, filling out forms while the world thinks you've disappeared. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: blood is not always loyalty, and love does not mean surrender. You have the right to protect yourself, even from those you once rocked to sleep. So I ask you now, those listening, have you faced betrayal from someone you trusted most? Share it with me below. We're strangers here, but in truth, we carry the same wounds. I'll leave you with this. Forgiveness may be holy, but survival is necessary. And sometimes, choosing yourself is the most faithful act of all.